TFP, also known as Tradition, Family and Property, are a traditional Catholic pressure organization founded by Plino Carrera de Oliveira, originating in Brazil in the 1960s and eventually spreading throughout the world. TFP has long been an insurrection movement within Catholicism, with a distinct way of working by fusing social conservatism with economic liberalism. TFP spread across other Latin American countries, with it preaching the Catholic subjects of Latin America in the 60s 70s of anti-communism and liberation theology, with itself spreading to the likes of the West in the late 70s and early 80s with varying success. To the average Western eye, when we see TFP, we see strong men fighting for average Catholic values and being quite evangelical with its work, and would annoy your average sola scriptura fidei Protestant. However, the cause of TFP and its hidden background is something to raise a debate in the West, and especially in America, as to quote the moderate Catholic think tank Where Peter Is. It states, TFP plays a significant role in the North American Church, especially in the grassroots mobilization against the current pontiff and his call to keep those in need. Before I start this video, I must stress that this is my opinion and that this has no intentions to slander or to defame, but rather, like I said, to open the debate and raise awareness about the issues which will be presented in this video. If TFP or any organization would like to rebuttal these claims rather than sending a small YouTuber or cease or desist or suing me, because you can, give us specific responses to the allegations and the proof provided. With that out the way, let me get straight into the video. On the surface, everyone thinks that TFP is a well-agreeable group of Catholic individuals. However, the more you climb their ranks, the weirder it gets. I thought at first, why would this be the case, as they have Western cardinals and bishops supporting TFP, but that's the supposed model of TFP, as it was Plino himself who designated what should be done and what should be said in each chapter of TFP. To simplify the problems of TFP, it revolves around pagan cults, slave mentality, and some underworld type of mythicalism. Why in the West does nobody know such heresies of TFP, while everyone knows about it in the Latin world? It is in by large of a certain history professor called Orlando Fedeli, who converted to Catholicism because of TFP when he joined in the early stages. He was part of the dark and he knew everything going on in the inner circles of TFP. He started suspecting something fishy was going on, and that's when he found out a litany dedicated to Dr. Plino's mother. Some guy was praying to it and he was listening. He was very confused by it and tried talking to Plino about it. Plino denied that he had anything to do with it. Then, like my friend Aloysia puts it, the house of cards started crumbling down. Playing in the video right now, there are some pictures of Donna Lucia, and if you don't know who Donna Lucia is the mother of Dr. Plino. There's some pictures of Donna Lucia prayer cards, and Dr. Plino and Donna Lucia reliquaries, with the bottom reliquaries stating, slaves of Dr. Plino. To further claims against TFP with this cult idea is that of Alita Cinque Guemes, a person close to TFP. In 1985, in a news article, he admitted that a person called Jao Cla Xavier da Silveira, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, consecrated himself to slave of Dr. Plino in 1961. Attila Cinqueguemes was the secretary of the MNF, short for Manifest, a series of secret conferences by Dr. Plino. He later founded the blog Tradition in Action, an obscure blog that is still up to this day, and I'll link it down below. He himself said once that the divine presence in Dr. Plino was bigger than the burning bush, and that he would argue with Moses about it and win in heaven. Most disturbingly though is the video of TFP doing some ritual type of praise acts of praying to Doncha Lucia and Dr. Plino. No Pais Maravillas, a book from Professor Orlando, which roughly translates to In Wonderland, gives us a bit more information on that video and cultish acts of TFP. In 1967, Pino Carrera de Oliveira began to call himself the intermediary of Our Lady, and the members of the Ever-Living started to consecrate to Our Lady in the hands of Dr. Plino, who said he accepted to be the intermediary between the Virgin Mary and the members of the Ever-Living as their slaves. Beginning in 1975, Plino presented himself as a religious founder at Ever-Living, the official name of the secret institution set up by Dr. Plino was Sacred Slavery, since all its members in the initiation ceremony had to make a personal consecration as slaves of Dr. Plino, giving their body and soul interior and exterior goods along the same lines as S. Louis de Montfort recommends that the consecration to Our Lady be made. In fact, the text of the consecration to Our Lady by S. Louis de Montfort was used as it appears in his Treatise of True Devotion to Our Lady, with slight adaptations to make the consecration of a slave to Dr. Plino. Also more with Orlando's book. When the deponent Plino Ignacio went to talk to Dr. Plino on June 11th, 1998, about the conversation he had with Orlando the previous day, he heard from him that his consecration as a slave to him would be just because he would be Our Lady's mediator with the slave, or else the guardian of this consecration. Also, in the clandestine order of TFP, some hermits make a vow of obedience to Our Lady represented on earth by Dr. Plino. Only the deponent Plino Diamas, the most involved of those who testified, said that during being consecrated as Dr. Plino's slave, the Revolution and Counter-Revolution manuscript was signed in blood. Note that on October 13th, 1967, the 50th anniversary of the apparitions of Fatima, Dr. Plino organized a great ceremony at TFP's headquarters at Rua Para. In this ceremony, everyone had to renew their consecration to Our Lady, kneeling before Dr. Plino, who, seated on a throne, held an iron chain that hung from the image of Our Lady in a niche behind his throne. Then the chain was presented by Dr. Plino, was kissed, and a consecration was signed in blood that almost everyone believed to be Our Lady. On other occasions, documents were signed in blood, so this is a ritual that is very much in the style of TFP and Dr. Plino. Also, all the slaves chose a new name within the sect. Always started with Plino, because the slave became an alter Plinus. By consecration to Dr. Plino, one was reborn. The old man died, the new man was born. That is why the slave should change his name. He was now, after consecration, a new Plino. Every new slave left his own name and changed his name to Plino, and the name of a patron saint, followed by the title of Our Lady. X became, after the initiation, Plino Bernardo Diamus Longinus of Our Lady, Holy Queen of the Apostle of the Last Times, known only by Plino Diamas. When they signed the original name, the slave commented, "This guy has already died." To touch on the slaves of Dr. Plino reliquaries and pins, it appears there was an inner circle which they called the ever-living, Sempre Viva. It's the name of a flower that is said to look dead when it's alive and live when it's dead. It's somewhat important to note that adjectives in Portuguese usually have a gender. In this case, living is in the feminine. What does this mean? Who knows? Maybe a reference to Donna Lucia, mother of Plino, especially when it was a secret society item. With Jao Cla, favourite of Plino, his protégé, and faithful interpreter of the Prophet, justifying it by saying, "If the revolution uses it, why shouldn't we use it? Let us be astute as serpents." Here I have a video of the ceremony of the ever-living. It is important to notice that a person, I believe in 1 minute 25 seconds in the video, says, "History is divided before and after our Lord Jesus Christ, but the apex of this after was given to thee, Plino, to be instirred by thine prophetic hands."
Centro de toda a história, sim, porque assim está ela dividida em antes e depois de nosso Senhor Jesus Cristo. Mas esse depois nunca chegou ao seu auge. o auge desse depois de nosso Senhor Jesus Cristo, foi posto em vossas guerreiras e proféticas mãos, para que vós o instaureis na face da terra. Confite ora Deo omnipotens,
Ora tirar o capuz.
Palavras que comoveriam algum outro, que me comoveram a mim, no meio de tantas palavras, nada me agradou tanto quanto ser chamado romano. É isso que nós precisamos fazer. Com minha recomendação dar agora, eu vou dar uma recomendação especial a essa implacabilidade.
Que coisa. Perdão.
Eu pedi para o dia porque ainda quero vir à saúde.
To begin this sentence with Jao Cla is treading on ice, as he is the founder of the hurdles of the Gospels, which I've heard evidentially has a good court team, and I've heard from word-to-word sources that they like to take anything to court. But I feel like I need to mention hurdles of the Gospels, as this has to do with the TFP problem we see. Dr. Plino was widely thought in the TFP to be immortal, or at best he would live to see the millennialist delirium come true. The belief of the TFP was said to be, I shall not die before I lay foundations to the kingdom of Mary. This kingdom of Mary was how they called their millennium, to so speak. It didn't happen, and he didn't designate an heir after all. An immortal man doesn't need one. So when he died and didn't resurrect on the third day, as some expected, there was a TFP schism. Factions were on one side. There was Jao Cla, his protege of Plino, the faithful interpret of the prophet. On the other, there was the Provex, the old men who were with him for a long time. The factions emerged around three main differences: the use of the TFP brand, the future directions of the TFP as a political campaigning organization, and the religious teachings of the organization. This led to the legal actions with a series of decisions from the Brazilian courts in 1997 and 2004, ultimately won by Jao Cla. While he had created the hurdles of the Gospels in 2001, he had a long-standing project of creating a religious order, so it was natural for him to own both TFP and hurdles of the Gospels. Those who oppose the court ruling plot have remained active in the associations of the founders of TFP and created the Plino Carrera de Oliveira Institute, while the hurdles retained the rights to the TFP brand in Latin America. Although they have the rights to Latin America TFP, they do not actively exercise it, driving the TFP institution in South America to slowly fade into obscurity. The point of this was that the Brazilian media found out of creepy videos of exorcism by hurdles of the Gospels, a bit like the ones of TFP. In those videos, the devil said the Pope Francis was his puppet and that he would eventually die by the intercession of Dr. Plino. They admit themselves about this, clarifying it was an old video and that the leak had occurred improperly as it was for theological studies. One can ask now, what other material and incorrect theological studies TFP and other related to Jao Cla's group have like this? Also, as one of the modern representatives of TFP, they publicly seem to promote a Hurdles young man praying before a huge picture of Donna Lucia and a small frame picture of Dr. Plino, which is not out of the blue for them. This video not even diving into the rabbit hole of TFP and its behavior. What steps have the church taken or noticed about TFP, and has TFP and its followers said anything in its defense? As a Catholic, when we see TFP or sister organizations, we should not fear, as said in Psalms 37:20-23, as it states, "But my enemies live and are stronger, that I and they hate me wrongfully are multiplied. They that render evil for good have detracted me because I followed goodness. Forsake me not, O Lord my God. Do not thou depart from me. Turn unto my help, O Lord, the God of my salvation." Antonio de Castro Meyer, a famous traditional bishop who was a close ally of SSPX founder Archbishop Marcel, was at best against TFP, although in the starting stages of TFP, with himself not knowing much, he signed a TFP coordinated campaign to collect signatures denouncing what was perceived as egalitarian communists in the church. Meyer encouraged the campaign, but as 1968 rolled fast away with the inner problems of the Second Vatican Council of its waves of reform, Meyer resigned from his clergy position, as he spent the next few years using his influence to shape politics and the views of Latin America. While this was happening, Meyer himself took a notice of the illusion of TFP, and himself denouncing TFP and endorsing the NCBB text of 1985, which I'll get onto later. He famously wrote a letter called Letter from Antonio de Castro Meyer on TFP. It was a letter from a person I'm assuming who knew a mother's son who was a TFPster. To simplify the mail, the lad was a certain fanatic of TFP who was blinded of the fact of the dogma of fide, which best described by SSPX as shepherds and flocks, those who belong to the various levels of the hierarchy and the multitude of the faithful. These two orders are so completely distinct that only the hierarchy has the right and the authority to guide and govern members for the church, while the duty of the faithful is to allow themselves to be governed and to obediently follow the path given. Driven by the encyclical of the Venermenter, this idea has been the fundamental of the Church's constitution. It was also the apostles that Jesus said, "Go and teach all nations." The Acts of the Apostles also show us the life of the Church in the times after Jesus Christ. What differed from the TFP and the Church was that it was inherently anti-clerical. Meyer goes into detail that TFP assumes that priests are ignorant, fusilious, or interested in other things, and states the divine constitution and directed by Jesus Christ that the anti-clericalism at TFP makes it a heretical group. Going a bit more of its roles in the positions, and when reversing them, putting the clergy in tow behind a charismatic layman, which is TFP, is against according to its ideals. Also in the letter, it expresses Meyer's regrets of endorsing and associating with TFP. The NCBB text of the Brazilian bishops reprimanded TFP for its esoteric character, the religious fanaticism, the cult given to the personality of its leader and his mother, the abusive use of the name of Mary Most Holy, according to the news items circulated, cannot in any way merit the approval of the Church, as it quotes. It touched as well on how bishops of Brazil exhort Catholics not to join TFP or collaborate with them. What did TFP do in response to this? Well, in short, they gave a response to the NCBB the next day, keeping in mind this was the Brazilian main TFP branch, and a second 2007 American TFP response to the 1985 NCCB, as it apparently resurfaced. TFP also made two books on defending themselves, with them repeating the same point. I will touch on the 2007 American response, as it has the most and mentions the earlier Brazilian response. The American Society of TFP stated 10 reasons for its defense. Firstly, the 1985 NCBB note must be in two contexts. Secondly, on false accusations of the leftist media. Thirdly, Brazilian TFP's following statement to the press for a canonical inquiry. The fifth one being an impact topic. The sixth one being on separate branches. Seventh, on clergy support. Eighth, on another response. Ninth, the ways and means and how the note was wanted by. 10th being proof. Firstly, it espouses a leftist media row against the Brazilian TFP, mentioning how the press was on a spree of false accusations circulated by the media. To quote as well, this is from the 1985 NCBB note, when it states, according to news items circulated, with the second context of land squabbles of the NCBB and TFP in the early years of Brazil. I am all against left-wing institutions creeping with their influence and the left-wing media sentiment, However, from my research of Brazilian government affairs and analogy, I see this as a curveball answer that it's too broad. I cannot give a sound answer to this as this is a wide topic, but I could not find any at all reason to believe there was a firm left-wing influence biased in 1980s Brazil. But I could just not be searching in the right place. The second context was on the topic of Brazilian land reform, which at best is a controversial topic and a long one for a different time. But the argument it places is to deflect and to say the NCBB is against church teachings for favoring the reform, and that the problem at hand is the reason why they authorized the 1985 note, because the NCBB and the TFP had polarizing opinions on the land reform. While I do disagree with the land reform stated by the NCBB in Brazil, I certainly do not think that it was due to land reform that the NCBB wanted TFP outed. Rather, it had to do with the quote-unquote from the NCBB note, which I agree with, of its esoteric character, the religious fanaticism, the cult given to the personality of its leader and its mother, the abusive use of her name, the Mary Most Holy, which cannot in any way merit the approval of the Church. The second point TFP espouses is that bishops who approved of the 1985 NCBB note did never respond to TFP's response beforehand of their books of their defense. The TFP response right after the NCBB note, which is on point 3, consisted primarily of 3 books: The Vein of Onslaught, Reflections and Examples of Saints of Our Time, and the Verdict Report. It further tries to legitimize its points by pointing out Father Victorino reviewed both books thoroughly and gave a written opinion in which he vouches for TFP. Firstly, to touch on to the books mentioned, the refutation of the TFP to the frustrated onslaught. The book, like mentioned earlier, can be a refutation in itself, as it was Attila Cinca Gomes who wrote the book, as we know, admitted Cal Vidigal Xavier da Silveira consecrated himself as a slave to Dr. Plino in 1961. Also, as we know, Gomes was the secretary of the MNF, a series of secret conferences by Dr. Plino, and later on he founded Tradition in Action, where he indirectly confirms all the claims of the NCBB. Although Father Victorino gave TFP the thumbs up, this does not mean anything in the wider sense that most Brazilian bishops and cardinals, both traditional and liberal ones, still disagree with TFP and saw a wider danger, thus voted on the NCBB. But this is in no way to disrespect Father Victorino's intellect. The third point is the Brazilian TFP response to the press day after the NCBB note. I will link the NCBB note and the 2007 American TFP Society response in the Google Drive folder. To summarize the TFP response, it denies the accusations are true. They admit submission to the vigilance of the hierarchy in matters of faith and morals, reiterates its willingness to accept correction should any error or illicitness of any actions by the organization be proven. Finally, they request specificity, clarity, and proofs in the charges against the organization, as opposed to vague and generic accusations. I only have 2 things about the TFP rebuttal, and it's that the model of the TFP is to create a new Catholic society, not the one already bred by church tradition, so it was rash to say they admit submission to the church's dogma on the hierarchy, as it collides with their actions. There is also nothing wrong with disagreeing with a certain member of the clergy and his stances, like Father James and his heretic ways. They need to be stopped, and questions need to be asked about him. However, as I touched on idolatry, when the sheep becomes a shepherd, like TFP presents itself, we need to enter a dilemma of what is presented and what they want. They ask for proof and clarity, and I right here in this video showed proof and the links of what the NCBB couldn't have presented. But let's say hypothetically we were in 1985. What proof would I have? Well, none, but instead we would have the people coming out and whistleblowing, testifying. Although not always true, and the case can be a person just incriminating data on TFP, to get an upper hand. We must realize that there has been several people leaving TFP and telling the public about the rituals and the problems of TFP. To be honest, this point of mine is weak and not the backbone of anything, rather that it calls for proof and concrete evidence from the inner circle claims, which is hard to get information from without a canonical inquiry. So it's an obvious point to point out if you're the defendant. This notion has been done throughout history, that some government or big organization asks for proof. All I'm saying is that the defense point of asking for clarity proof, neither nada, for the 1980s is an inconclusive point to point out. Point number 4 of the TFP, I give credit where it's due. Like I mentioned earlier of canonical inquiries, it states Brazilian TFP's denial of charges, public submission to the episcopal vigilance, willingness to accept correction. So why don't the Brazilian bishops contact the Brazilian TFP to institute a canonical inquiry? It would have been better if the TFP and the canonical inquiry were to solve this situation, but this never came to be, so we would never know the official verdict. Point number 5. The TFP's response was that of the 1985 NCBB note had no impact on the Brazilian Catholic support for TFP. I can't comment much on this, as it seems the information of membership and donors is not available to the public domain, but the thought of the long-term impact of the TFP to this and the census of people I've asked is many Brazilians seem to disapprove of its actions and its history of the TFP. But I do have to mention, although this is the case for many of them recognize TFP's outer help of Catholicism. Number 6. The point sidetracks and states American TFP is not the subject of the 1985 NCBB note. It states the Brazilian TFP and the American TFP are separate autonomous organizations. Each TFP is solely responsible for its actions. However, when Brazilian TFP is the main branch, the original branch of the TFP sister organizations, which dominates the sentiment and what agenda, with Plino himself who designated what should be done and what should be said in each chapter until his death, is something to raise an eyebrow. It was Dr. Plino himself who said in the interview that TFP is a family of souls and that they are all united in a bond which cannot be explained. 7th was the fact many Brazilian bishops after the note worked with TFP, which exhorts Catholics not to join TFP, collaborate with it. I am on no one's side when it comes to this note, as the Brazilian clergy had its ups and downs, but it was obvious from the start the bishops were still going to work with TFP, as it, after all, was one of the biggest at its times for Catholic political work in various regions. But I do see the hypocrisy of the Brazilian clergy, but that does not mean all bishops ever since broke the NCBB note promise. The 8th point is something I can't comment on, as it's a dead link and nothing much. Feel free to read it if you want. Everything will be on the Google Drive. Second last point of their defense commandments was that of TFP never mentioned anything about the NCBB being an unsigned note. The final point is that of the existence of the 1985 NCBB note and how it can be authenticated. That repeats most of the third points of the rebuttal, and once again to save itself from Western scrutiny by stating this is not the case of the American TFP, as each TFP is autonomous. To summarize the last point and the whole rebuttal, this was one giant massive cope for us, in that they didn't give one. That the only thing the American Society TFP had to do was say they are distinct from its main source of the origin of the Brazilian TFP to be acquitted of sorts of behavior. Is it the case that it is only the Brazilian TFP who have been misleading? Certainly not. Look at France with its long TFP until it fell with the government investigation of cult behavior. But in defense, 22 Catholic bishops did defend TFP in a joint letter to the government of France. But more information and government articles and whistleblowers have come out to not defend the French TFP. That's a whole different subject for a different time. Well, this can be the same case with the TFP branch of America with John T. Armour's case. I won't go into detail, but the TFP rebuttal was not strong to say at least. A Catholic Truth blog with what I assume American Catholics dive into the mentions of John T. Armour. Special shout out to users Peterus and Athanasius who really hit on spot with the John Armour case. Am I, as a critic of TFP, wrong then? Is the TFP a cult, or is it a valuable asset for the fight back of tradition, helping to fight back to restore Catholic morality in Western secular societies? Is the organization itself great? Well, it's a counter-revolutionary organization, opposing communism and dialect materialism, both things condemned by the Church and something we should relish. And I do myself like Revolution and Counter-Revolution by Dr. Plino himself, but while all being said, there are far too many stories and cases to recount here on TFP and its sinister heresies. What ought to happen, even if this is too late, is that we need to push for a canon investigation and debate in your average Catholic communities whether Catholic orders are needed to help in the fight back for morality, and in specific TFP and other sister TFP groups. And how far can our Vatican trust these orders, and at what cost? This is that of the quote, "There is a greater zeal in a convert," and what I mean by this is that it only takes one to know one, and that with this proof and testimonies, it will only be a matter of weeks if the TFP branches and sister branches are even open to be led by account by the followers ourselves. To end this video, I mark it by the book of John. Love nor the world, nor the things which are in the world. If any man love the world, the charity of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, which is not of the Father, but is of the world. This is Right Honourable Limbu. I hope I have made your day.